Thousands come to his events. But that day in the crowd sat a man Tony Robbins couldn't control. When security tried to remove Chuck Norris, what happened next changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The city of Los Angeles shimmered under the weight of its own confidence. Billboards glared from every highway overpass, each bearing the same smiling face. Tony Robbins, his name emblazoned across a burst of light like a promise that no life would remain unchanged. Radio hosts repeated his slogans between car commercials. News anchors announced the event as though it were a national occasion. And somewhere above the Pacific, private jets descended carrying CEOs, influencers, and those who had spent $5,000 to scream their way to inner peace. The world's largest personal growth event was about to begin, and for one weekend, the city had become the pulsing heart of self-belief. By noon, the arena throbbed with anticipation. 40,000 people filed through metal detectors and into a cathedral built not for worship but for awakening. The air smelled faintly of perfume, coffee, and ozone from the lighting rigs that lined the ceiling. A colossal stage spread across one end of the stadium, dressed with LED screens the size of houses. The words "Unleash the Power Within" glowed in blinding white letters across a black void. Every seat came with a colored wristband, each shade a ticket tier, each tier a different promise of proximity to greatness. Volunteers clapped and shouted motivational phrases at strangers they'd never see again. Cameras swooped overhead on silent tracks, recording everything for the global live stream. Backstage, the machine purred in perfect rhythm. Technicians checked sound levels, producers rehearsed cue timings, assistants rushed with headsets and tablets. Everything moved toward one purpose: the entrance. When Tony finally emerged, the lights dimmed, and the crowd erupted with the sound of release. He strode onto the stage like a general entering battle tall, broad, a human engine of energy. His shirt sleeves were rolled. His face gleamed with the faint sheen of a man who lived inside adrenaline. The microphone curled around his cheek as naturally as a nerve. "Who's ready to change their life today?" he roared. The words struck the crowd like an electric charge. 40,000 voices answered back, a wave of screaming affirmation that rattled the rafters. Music blared, an anthem of triumph, and Tony raised his hands like a conductor summoning faith. For the next hour, he commanded not an audience, but a human tide. He paced, shouted, laughed, and whispered in perfect cadence, his timing measured by invisible teleprompters only his mind could see. Every sentence hit its mark. Every pause drew applause. He didn't speak to individuals. He detonated emotion across thousands. "You are not your past. You are your decisions. Say it with me." The crowd repeated in near ecstatic unison. In the control booth high above the stage, producers monitored screens divided into dozens of angles. The director spoke calmly into his mic. "Camera 3, tight on the front row tiers. Camera 4, sweep left, catch the guy punching the air." They knew the choreography of Euphoria as intimately as any television studio. This wasn't a seminar. It was a broadcast of salvation. Near the top of the arena, away from the fevered rhythm, a man sat quietly in the last row. He wore a simple checkered shirt, sleeves buttoned neatly at the wrist, jeans worn but clean. His hair was silver, trimmed close. His hands rested on his knees and his posture was straight, almost military. Around him, people leapt and shouted, fists in the air, repeating Tony's declarations with tearful conviction. But he remained still, watching the storm unfold below, with the calm of a man who'd seen too many storms to mistake their noise for power. It was Chuck Norris. He had slipped in unnoticed, entering through the general admission doors like any other ticket holder. There were no handlers, no press, no cameras trailing his every step. He had come out of curiosity or perhaps instinct. The culture of performance had fascinated and troubled him for years. Once, he too had been surrounded by crowds who projected onto him their ideas of strength. But time had carved through vanity like a quiet sculptor. Fame was noise, he had learned. Truth was stillness. From his seat, Chuck could see the entire theater of belief. The lights flashed across thousands of uplifted faces, each illuminated by hope and desperation in equal measure. It reminded him less of a motivational event than of combat training gone spiritual energy without direction, movement without purpose. He watched Tony with careful eyes, not judgmental, simply observant. The man's control of the crowd was formidable, almost beautiful in its precision. Yet beneath it, Chuck sensed something hollow, the echo of practiced certainty that left no space for silence. Down below, Tony continued his crescendo. "There's a giant within you," he shouted, "but you must wake him up." He pounded his chest. The audience mirrored him instantly. Drums thundered through the speakers. Fire cannons erupted along the stage edge, shooting flares into the air. The sensory overload was complete. People sobbed, shouted affirmations, hugged strangers. Tony smiled with practiced warmth. He lived for this connection, yet somewhere in the back of his mind, he noticed a flicker of resistance. A man sitting in the stillness amid his storm. It registered for a fraction of a second before being buried beneath applause. Behind the stage curtain, a woman with a headset noticed the same thing on one of the surveillance feeds. "Row 240, Section G, Camera 9, she said into her mic. "We've got someone not participating, just sitting there." The head of security, a muscular man in a dark blazer, leaned closer to the monitor. "Sleeping?" he asked. "No," the woman replied. "Watching." He frowned. "Have someone check it out. Mr. Robbins doesn't like dead zones on camera." The phrase dead zone was one they all used for people who didn't engage energy drainers, mood killers, silent question marks in a crowd built on synchronized motion. As two uniformed attendants began to climb the stairs toward the upper levels, Tony segued seamlessly into a story about triumph. His voice dropped lower, softer, wrapping around the audience like velvet. He told of hardship, of nights sleeping in a tiny apartment, of the hunger that drove him to build an empire. "Pain," he said, "is the signal that there's more of you left to discover." The crowd absorbed every word, bodies swaying like a single organism. When the attendants reached the final row, they paused, momentarily disarmed. The man they had been sent to confront looked back at them with calm, kind eyes that carried a weight they couldn't explain. Recognition hit one of them first. His mouth opened, then closed again. "Sir," he whispered, leaning toward his partner. "That's Chuck Norris." The words felt absurd, yet undeniable. Even aged, his face was unmistakable. The quiet steel of discipline etched into every line. The second attendant froze, unsure whether to proceed or salute. Down in the control booth, the director's voice crackled. "Report. Is he disruptive?" "No, sir," came the uncertain reply. "He's just sitting." Tony's next segment was about fear, the illusion that paralyzes potential. "Stand up if you've ever been afraid of failing," he commanded. Thousands stood. "Now shout the opposite. I am not afraid." The room shook with volume. Only one man remained seated. Cameras scanning for energy accidentally framed him for a split second on the massive screen. For the briefest moment, 40,000 people saw the calm, motionless figure at the top of the arena. Murmurs rippled. Tony noticed. His performer's instinct sharpened instantly. Resistance had entered the narrative. He smiled wide and gestured toward the upper section. "Even Chuck Norris has come to join us today." The crowd erupted again, thrilled by the celebrity mention. Phones lifted like a forest of glowing leaves. But up in the shadows, Chuck did not move. "Come on, Chuck!" Tony laughed through the mic, a good-natured challenge. "Share your secret. How do you crush fear?" The arena chanted his name now. Chuck, Chuck, Chuck. Tony extended his hand dramatically toward the cameras as though summoning him through sheer will. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. Then slowly, Chuck leaned forward just enough for his voice to carry. It was quiet, but somehow reached every corner of the hall. "I don't crush fear," he said. "I listen to it." The sound of his voice was like the sudden absence of noise. The chant stopped mid-syllable. The music cut. Even Tony stood still, blinking under the stage lights as though a chord had been struck somewhere inside him. Chuck didn't smile. He simply returned to stillness, hands folded in his lap, gaze forward. The silence lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, but it felt endless. Then the crowd began to murmur again, uncertain, nervous. Tony forced a laugh, tried to reframe the moment. "That's wisdom right there," he said brightly. "Let's give it up for him." Applause followed obediently, but something invisible had changed. The rhythm of the spectacle had faltered, the illusion of perfect control fractured by a man who had done nothing at all. Backstage, confusion spread through the earpieces of producers and assistants. "What was that? Do we cut to promo footage? No, stay live." Tony continued, recovering his rhythm, but the crack remained. He smiled wider, moved faster, raising his voice higher. The audience responded, but the energy had shifted into something forced. From his seat, Chuck simply watched. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was witnessing the machinery of persuasion straining against the weight of authenticity. When the show finally ended, after 6 hours of orchestrated transformation, people stumbled out into the night drained but euphoric. They exchanged numbers, selfies, promises to change their lives. The air outside smelled of rain and exhaust. Inside, janitors swept confetti from the aisles. In the upper row, Chuck still sat, the crowd gone, the arena hollow. The silence after the storm felt deeper than any sermon. He rose, adjusted his collar, and descended the stairs alone. No one noticed him leave. On stage below, Tony stood surrounded by his crew, accepting congratulations, already planning the next day's agenda. Yet his eyes kept drifting toward the darkened seats above. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt unsettled, like a man who had seen his reflection in another's stillness and found it unfamiliar. In the green room later, while assistants packed up equipment and congratulated one another on record attendance, he replayed the moment in his mind, the calm voice that had sliced through the noise. He poured himself a glass of water, staring at his trembling hand. For the first time in years, he realized he was not sure what power really meant. He set the glass down and turned toward the window overlooking the empty arena. The seats looked like the surface of an ocean now stilled after a storm. Somewhere in those shadows had sat a man who didn't need applause, who didn't need to prove strength by shouting it. A man whose silence had done what his own words could not. Tony didn't know it yet, but the empire he had built on noise had just begun to tremble. The night after the event, the city lay quiet beneath a thin veil of coastal fog. The arena that had roared with 40,000 voices now slept like an exhausted beast. Crews rolled up cables, screens went dark, and the air that had once vibrated with chanting dissolved into silence. In a suite high above the stadium, Tony Robbins sat before a panoramic window, the lights of Los Angeles blinking far below, like distant applause fading into memory. He should have felt triumphant. Every metric of success was their sold-out crowd, flawless production, ecstatic testimonials flooding social media before midnight. Yet beneath the numbers, something refused to settle. In the quiet, he could still hear that voice, the one that had sliced through the air without effort or volume. "I don't crush fear, I listen to it." He replayed the moment again and again, trying to understand why it lingered. He had spent decades teaching millions to face fear, to rewire their minds, to master emotion through energy. And yet one sentence from a man who hadn't even stood up had undone an entire crescendo of certainty. It wasn't defiance that unsettled him. It was the absence of it. That calm acceptance had drained the tension out of the word fear, like removing poison from a wound. Tony had built an empire on movement, on the conviction that transformation required thunder. But that man had brought stillness, and somehow the crowd had gone silent not out of command, but out of recognition. Downstairs in the production office, the team was still buzzing. Screens replayed clips, editors cataloged highlights, assistants compared crowd metrics. One of them, a sharp young producer named Leah, knocked on the suite door holding a tablet. "Tony, we pulled analytics from the live feed. That moment with Chuckets exploding online. Twitter, TikTok, everywhere. People are quoting him, remixing it, debating it. Half the comments say it was staged, half say it was divine." Tony glanced at the screen. A dozen clips looped simultaneously, fans shouting, the pause, the camera catching Norris's still face, the haunting line delivered with impossible calm. It had already become a symbol, stripped of context and meaning, swallowed by the digital hunger for novelty. "We should ride this," Leah continued enthusiastically. "Capitalize on it before someone else does. Maybe a joint session, Tony Robbins and Chuck Norris. Facing fear. We can pitch it as mutual respect between masters of strength. He smiled faintly, though the idea made him uneasy. Leah, he said quietly, what did you feel in that moment? She hesitated. Honestly, it scared me. Not him, just how quiet it got. Like everyone realized for a second that they didn't need to shout. He nodded. And what did you do when it ended? I started clapping, she admitted, because it felt wrong not to. Tony's gaze drifted back to the window. Exactly, he said. Noise fills the space where we're afraid to listen. After she left, he lingered by the window for a long while, watching fog drift over the darkened parking lot. Somewhere beyond the city, beyond the glittering towers and cameras, Chuck Norris was probably already asleep. There had been no ego in his words, no attempt to seize attention. He had simply been. The thought both humbled and unnerved him. The next morning, as dawn bled over the horizon, Tony returned to the arena early, before the staff arrived. He walked through the empty seats, his footsteps echoing softly. The stage still smelled of smoke and sweat, remnants of yesterday's manufactured catharsis. He climbed the steps, stood in the center of the platform, and looked out at the vast emptiness. Without the crowd, the place felt hollow, like an instrument waiting to be played. He closed his eyes and whispered under his breath, testing the words. I don't crush fear. I listen to it. The sound of his own voice startled him. It felt smaller here, less certain. By mid-morning, the building had come alive again. Technicians bustled around, resetting for day 2 of the seminar. Assistants rehearsed cues, the DJ tested the speakers, and the air once more filled with the hum of preparation. But Tony felt a subtle dissonance, as if he were watching his own empire from the outside. During the warm-up session, as his team led the audience in rhythmic clapping and cheers, he watched faces from behind the curtain. The same frenzy, the same need. Yet now he couldn't unsee the fatigue behind their eyes. He noticed how the smiles slipped the moment the music stopped. Backstage, the head of security approached with a nervous smile. Morning, boss. We, had a situation last night. The man in the upper row your team told me not to remove him once they recognized who he was. Tony looked up. Chuck Norris. The guard nodded, relieved he didn't have to explain. Yes, sir. Didn't cause any trouble, just didn't play along. You want us to invite him back today? Media's asking if he'll return. Tony hesitated. No. Leave him be. The man doesn't need another stage. The guard nodded and left, and Tony stood alone for a moment, his reflection trembling faintly on the black floor of the stage. He realized with a slow dread that his entire career had been about control of energy, of crowds, of narrative. And one man's quiet had unraveled that illusion like thread. That evening's session began like all the others, bright lights, pounding music, choreographed enthusiasm. Yet Tony felt the performance sag beneath its own weight. He moved through his stories with precision, but the words sounded hollow in his ears. The audience cheered on cue, but their voices no longer reached him. Somewhere amid the roar, he thought he heard silence pressing against the edges of sound, like the memory of something purer trying to break through. When the session finally ended, he slipped out the side door, avoiding the crowd of fans waiting for selfies. The night air hit him like a shock. He walked without direction through the city, past neon diners and dark storefronts, the hum of traffic surrounding him. For the first time in years, he felt anonymous. No cameras, no team, no applause, just footsteps and the rhythmic pulse of his own heart. He found himself thinking of Norris again, of the stillness in his eyes. What was that look? Peace? Discipline? Or something deeper? A freedom Tony had never known because he had spent his life trying to manufacture it for others? Hours later, back in his hotel, he sat on the edge of the bed, unable to sleep. The suite was silent except for the soft buzz of the minibar. On the table beside him lay a dozen congratulatory notes from sponsors and corporate partners. They all spoke the same language numbers, impact, influence, yet none of them mentioned truth. He reached for his phone, scrolling past the endless flood of messages until he found one labeled unknown. It had been forwarded to him by an old martial arts contact the night before. If you ever want to talk, I'm in Texas. No cameras. It was signed simply CN. Tony stared at it for a long time. His instinct was to schedule, to plan, to control the narrative before stepping into it. But something stopped him. The simplicity of the invitation stripped him bare. No cameras. He typed 3 words, "I'll come alone," and pressed send. The following days passed in a blur of routine. Interviews, photo ops, meetings. Yet beneath every conversation ran the undercurrent of disquiet. During one interview, a reporter asked about the viral moment. "You've built your career on energy," she said. "How did it feel when someone turned that energy into silence?" Tony paused longer than expected. Cameras waited. He finally answered, "It felt honest." "Hi!" The producer gestured for a retake, thinking he had misspoken, but he waved them off. That night, while the city glittered outside his window, he replayed footage of the previous events. The screens in his home office showed his greatest hits crowds roaring, tears streaming, people reborn in spectacle. And then among the reels, the moment, a close-up of Chuck Norris, motionless amid the chaos. Tony froze the frame. The man's face was calm, illuminated by soft light, neither challenging nor submitting, simply being. Tony leaned back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. In the days that followed, the company's executives bombarded him with ideas. Limited edition merchandise, quoting the viral phrase, a podcast with Norris. New branding campaigns around facing fear differently. He approved none of them. Each proposal felt like a lie, a way to monetize something that had made him question the entire premise of his empire. Leah noticed the change. "You've gone quiet," she said one afternoon. "You used to feed off this stuff. Now it's like you're somewhere else." Tony looked at her and said softly, "Maybe for the first time I am." That evening, he packed a single bag, left a note for his team, and caught a late flight to Texas. No entourage, no PR crew, no camera. Just him, alone. As the plane rose through the night sky, the city lights dwindled below, shrinking into a pattern of flickering dots. He stared out the window and thought about how much of his life had been built on brightness stages, screens, spotlights, and how little of it he had spent in the dark where truth lived. When he landed at dawn, the world felt stripped of spectacle. The air smelled of earth and rain. He rented an unmarked car and drove out toward the countryside, passing empty fields and long stretches of 2-lane road. With every mile, the noise of his world faded further behind him. Somewhere beyond the horizon waited a man who had dismantled him without trying, who had shown him that stillness could be stronger than momentum. Tony didn't know what he would say when they met, or if there were words at all that could bridge the chasm between them. But he knew this much: he wasn't coming to teach. He was coming to learn. He pressed the accelerator gently, the hum of the engine blending with the wind. In the distance, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the fields. It was the first sunrise he had watched in years without thinking of an audience. And as the road stretched endlessly ahead, for the first time in his life, Tony Robbins felt something rare and unfamiliar. Not power, not purpose, but peace. The small Texas town of Rome woke slowly under a pale sunrise, the kind that didn't announce itself with brilliance, but crept in gently, brushing the rooftops with muted gold. The air smelled faintly of cedar and earth after the night's rain. Tony Robbins drove down a narrow country road flanked by barbed wire fences and grazing cattle, the sleek rental car looking absurdly out of place against the quiet simplicity of the landscape. He hadn't spoken to anyone since leaving the airport. For a man who spent his life filling arenas with his voice, the silence pressed in around him like a new kind of atmosphere, dense but strangely liberating. Every mile away from the city felt like a mile closer to something unmeasured, something that demanded no applause. He followed the directions until the road turned to gravel and finally to dirt. A modest ranch came into view, fenced, sturdy, humble. The gate was open. He drove through, tires crunching softly, and parked beside an old pickup truck that looked like it had earned every dent it carried. Beyond the truck stood a one-story house, its porch framed by 2 rocking chairs and a faded American flag moving slightly in the breeze. The door opened before Tony could knock. Chuck Norris stepped out wearing jeans, a denim shirt, and boots that had seen real work. He looked smaller than Tony remembered from the stage, not in presence but in scaleless, like a figure of legend, and more like a man entirely at ease in his own frame. "Morning," Chuck said, his tone calm, friendly, unhurried. "Morning," Tony replied, closing the car door gently, almost reverently. They shook hands. Chuck's grip was firm but not performative. No test of dominance, just acknowledgement. "Long drive." "Not long enough," Tony said, smiling faintly. Chuck nodded, as if he understood. "Come inside, coffee's fresh." The living room was simple, almost austere. A bookshelf filled with worn paperbacks, photographs of family, and a few old martial arts trophies that looked forgotten more than displayed. On one wall hung a framed picture of Chuck and his wife in their younger days, smiling on a beach, sunlight over their shoulders. Tony noticed the absence of screens. No television, no tablet, just a small radio on a counter near the kitchen. Chuck poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed one over. "You take sugar?" "Black's fine." They sat opposite each other at a wooden table that had probably hosted decades of ordinary mornings. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was steady, grounded. Tony found himself lowering his shoulders, his breath sinking with the still rhythm of the place. Outside, birds called faintly through the trees. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Chuck said finally. "I wasn't sure either," Tony admitted, "but I haven't been sure of much lately." Chuck smiled slightly. "That's usually where truth starts." Tony studied him, searching for the right entry point. "You probably didn't mean to do it," he began carefully. "But what happened at the event, it stayed with me. You changed the whole room with one sentence. I've spent my whole life teaching people to take action, to move through fear, and then you said you listened to it. That's the opposite of what I've built everything on." Chuck nodded slowly, as if considering how to unwrap the meaning behind Tony's words. "You built something powerful," he said, "but maybe power and peace aren't the same thing." "I know," Tony said quietly. "That's what I've been afraid to admit." Chuck leaned back in his chair, looking out the window for a long moment. "When I was younger," he said, "I thought strength was about control of your body, your mind, your environment. The military taught me that. Hollywood rewarded me for it. People wanted to believe I could conquer anything. But control is just fear in disguise. It's the fear of stillness, because stillness shows you who you really are without the noise." Tony listened, his usual urge to respond or reframe fading. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a teacher. He felt like a student. "You don't think fear should be defeated?" Tony asked eventually. "No," Chuck said simply. "You can't defeat what's inside you. You can only understand it. Fear is not an enemy, it's a messenger. It tells you what still matters. When you crush it, you lose part of yourself." The words landed like stones dropped into deep water. Tony stared down at his hands, noticing for the first time how tightly he was holding his coffee mug. "I don't know if I can change," he said after a pause. "My whole life is built on performance. If I stop performing, the empire collapses." Chuck gave a small, knowing smile. "Then maybe it's time to find out what's left when it does." They sat in silence again, the morning light shifting across the floorboards. Somewhere outside, a windmill creaked. The world seemed to breathe differently here, slower, quieter, truer. After a while, Chuck stood. "Come on, I want to show you something." He led Tony out the back door, down a dirt path that wound through tall grass toward a small wooden structure near the edge of the property. It was an old barn, weathered but solid. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of hay and cedar oil. A single punching bag hung from a rafter, worn smooth from years of use. In the corner stood a simple wooden bench, beside it a Bible and a notebook. "This is where I train," Chuck said. "Not for fights anymore. Those days are long gone. I come here to stay honest. Every morning I work until the noise in my head stops." Tony walked slowly around the space, running a hand along the rough wood of the walls. "You built this yourself?" "Most of it. Took a while to get it right." Tony stopped beside the punching bag, staring at its surface. "How do you know when the noise stops?" Chuck stepped closer, his eyes calm but sharp. "When you stop trying to prove anything to yourself." They stood there in the dim light, surrounded by stillness. For a man who had spent decades amplifying every aspect of his life, Tony felt the strange relief of being unseen, unmeasured. He struck the punching bag once, lightly, the sound echoing hollowly. "Feels different when there's no one watching," he said. "That's the point," Chuck replied. "Strength without an audience becomes truth." Later they sat outside on the porch again, the sun higher now, the heat beginning to rise from the ground. They spoke for hours, though half of what passed between them needed no words. Chuck told stories of his military days, of nights spent alone in foreign deserts, learning that silence could be as loud as gunfire. Tony shared his memories of his first seminars, of the hunger that had driven him and the hollowness that followed each triumph. "You're not lost," Chuck said gently. "You're just between worlds, the one that made you and the one that's waiting for you." "And which one is this?" Tony asked, gesturing at the open fields. "This," Chuck said, "is where the noise ends." They sat watching the horizon as evening fell. The sun dropped slowly behind the trees, setting the sky aflame before fading into blue. Neither spoke for a long time. For Tony, it felt like the first genuine silence he had known since childhood. Not empty but full, dense with presence. He realized that silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of everything that words could never hold. When the first stars appeared, Chuck stood and stretched. "You'll stay here tonight," he said matter-of-factly. "Guest room's down the hall. There's no TV, but the bed's good." Tony wanted to protest, to say he'd booked a hotel, but the offer was too natural to refuse. "Thank you," he said simply. Later that night, lying in the small guest room, Tony listened to the soft creaks of the old house. Crickets chirped outside, and in the distance he could hear the faint hum of the windmill turning. He thought of all the stages he'd stood on, the voices, the applause, and realized how little of it had ever sounded like truth. He had spent his life teaching people to roar, but here, in the quiet of a Texas night, he understood something deeper, that silence could teach more than noise ever could. He fell asleep without planning the next day, without rehearsing answers, without imagining cameras. For once there was nothing to perform, there was only presence. In the early hours before dawn, he woke to find the house still dark. Through the window, the faint outline of the barn was visible against the dim sky. A light flickered inside. Curious, he rose quietly and stepped out into the cool air. The grass was wet with dew. Inside the barn, Chuck was already awake, practicing slow, deliberate movements. Tai Chi, perhaps, or some variation born of decades of discipline. His breathing was steady, his posture perfect. There was no performance in it, only communion. Tony stood at the doorway, unseen, and watched. It wasn't power in the way he'd known it. It was something quieter, deeper in authority that came from harmony rather than domination. For the first time, Tony understood what his entire career had been circling without reaching. That true transformation doesn't roar, it whispers. When Chuck finally turned and noticed him, he smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep?" "Didn't need to," Tony said softly. "Just wanted to see what peace looks like." Chuck nodded toward the empty mat beside him. "Then step in. The only way to see it is to practice it." And so, under the faint light of morning, the two men moved together in silence. The preacher of motion and the master of stillness, each learning from the other without words, without audience, without applause. Somewhere outside, the first rays of dawn broke over the fields, and for a brief, sacred moment, time itself seemed to bow its head. The morning after their shared practice, the Texas sky unfolded wide and clear, the kind of blue that felt both eternal and intimate. Tony woke to the smell of brewing coffee and the sound of quiet movement in the kitchen. For a moment he lay still, letting the rhythm of the house settle over him. There was no clock ticking, no phone buzzing on the nightstand. Time itself seemed to have loosened its grip. When he finally rose and stepped into the hallway, he found Chuck standing by the window, reading from a small leather-bound book that looked well-worn from years of handling. He closed it softly when he noticed Tony. "Sleep all right?" Chuck asked. "Better than I have in months," Tony said, his voice still rough from sleep. "It's so quiet here. I think the silence itself has weight." Chuck smiled. "That's how you know it's real. Noise fills the room, silence fills the soul." They ate breakfast in easy calm. Conversation came and went like the wind outside, soft, unforced. Tony noticed how different this felt from his usual mornings. where assistants and schedules dictated every minute. Here, each moment was its own, unmeasured, unmonetized. It made him uneasy and peaceful all at once. After breakfast, they walked outside. The sun was warm on their backs, the air carrying the scent of cedar and dust. Chuck led him to the edge of the property, where a small pond shimmered beneath the light breeze. 2 chairs stood beside it, weathered by rain and time. Chuck gestured for him to sit. "I wanted to show you something," he said, lowering himself into the other chair. "You've spent most of your life talking, teaching, leading crowds. I get it, I did my share performing too. But leadership isn't what happens when people follow you. It's what happens when they don't need you anymore." Tony frowned slightly. "So what happens when they stop listening?" "Then you start hearing," Chuck said simply. For a while they just sat there. Ducks glided lazily across the water, their ripples soft as breath. The stillness stretched until it became a kind of conversation in itself. Tony felt a strange sensation in his chest, an awareness that something inside him was loosening, uncoiling from years of tension. After a long silence, Chuck spoke again. "There's a reason you came here, Tony. You didn't drive across 3 states just to talk philosophy." Tony looked down at the ground, his thumb tracing the edge of his cup. "I don't know what I came for," he admitted. "Maybe to find out why everything that used to work doesn't anymore. The shows, the crowds, the message, it still moves people. But it doesn't move me. I feel like I'm selling echoes." "That's because the voice isn't coming from the same place anymore," Chuck said. "You've outgrown the noise." Tony laughed softly, but it carried a note of sadness. "That noise built my life." "And it might have saved it once," Chuck replied. "But not everything meant to start the fire is meant to keep it burning." The words lingered between them, heavy and true. Tony turned his gaze toward the water. He could see his reflection trembling in the ripples, distorted, uncertain. "So what do I do now?" he asked quietly. "Walk away? Shut it all down?" Chuck shook his head. "You don't destroy something just because you've seen through it. You redeem it. The world doesn't need fewer voices. It needs better ones, quieter ones, real ones." The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint rustle of the trees. Tony leaned back, the chair creaking beneath his weight. "How do you teach that?" he asked. "How do you teach silence?" "You don't," Chuck said. "You live it. People learn from what they feel, not what they hear." They spent the rest of the morning in companionable quiet. Chuck tended to a small garden while Tony helped repair a broken fence post near the barn. It was simple work, honest, repetitive, grounding. Each hammer strike felt like a small act of surrender. When they finished, they stood side by side, surveying the mended line. It wasn't perfect, but it held. So did Tony. Later, as they rested under the porch awning, Chuck spoke again. "I've been thinking, you're heading back soon, right?" "Tomorrow, maybe," Tony said. "The team's probably panicking already." "Good," Chuck said with a faint grin. "Let them. Sometimes you need to let the machine run without you just to see if it remembers why it started." Tony smiled, though he knew the thought of letting go would terrify his staff. "You sound like you've done that before." "More than once," Chuck said. "I used to think I had to be in control of everything. But the truth is, nothing real needs to be forced. Not faith, not family, not purpose. If it's true, it stands on its own." They sat quietly for a long time. Tony's phone vibrated in his pocket, a reflexive pulse of obligation. He didn't reach for it. When it buzzed again, Chuck looked over at him. "Test number 1, he said softly. Tony smiled and let it go silent. By evening, the light turned amber. Chuck grilled steaks out back while Tony set the table on the porch. They ate watching the sun sink into the fields. It wasn't ceremony, just 2 men and the sound of crickets waking in the grass. After dinner, Tony leaned back, the sky turning violet overhead. "Chuck," he said after a pause, "when you walked away from Hollywood, weren't you afraid of losing who you were?" Chuck looked thoughtful. "I didn't walk away," he said. "I just stopped running toward it. The man people saw on screen was a piece of me, not the whole thing. When I stopped feeding that piece, the rest finally got a chance to grow." "And what did you find?" "Peace," Chuck said, "but not the easy kind. The kind that comes after you face yourself without the spotlight." The words hit Tony harder than he expected. He thought of all the times he had stood under blinding lights, surrounded by roaring crowds, yet felt utterly alone. He realized then how long it had been since he had allowed himself to simply be quiet with who he was, not the brand, not the teacher, just the man. When the dishes were cleared, Chuck walked to the barn and returned carrying a small canvas bag. "Here," he said, handing it to Tony. "Take this home." Tony opened it and found a simple wooden carving of two hands pressed together, rough and unpolished. "I made that years ago," Chuck said, "when I first started learning to listen instead of talk. It's a reminder. You don't build peace with words. You build it with what you stop saying." Tony turned the carving in his hands. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but it radiated sincerity. "I'll keep it," he said quietly. That night, as Tony packed his things, the house was silent again, but it was a living silence filled with the weight of everything he had seen and heard in stillness. He looked out the window one last time, seeing Chuck sitting alone on the porch, head bowed slightly, not in prayer, but reflection. The sight filled him with something like gratitude and ache combined. The next morning they stood by the truck as the sun rose. "You'll know what to do when you get back," Chuck said. "Just don't rush it. Silence doesn't shout instructions." Tony nodded, gripping his hand firmly. "You've given me more than advice," he said. "You've given me a mirror." Chuck's smile was small but genuine. "Then look into it often." As Tony drove away, the ranch faded into the morning light. The road stretched ahead, long and empty, but for the first time, emptiness didn't feel like absence. It felt like space. He rolled down the window, letting the warm air flood in. No playlist, no voice recording, no motivational track to fill the silence. Just the sound of the tires humming against the asphalt and the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. By the time he reached the highway, his phone had collected dozens of missed calls and messages. He ignored them all until one caught his eye, a text from Leah, his producer. "Everyone's asking when you're back. Tomorrow's keynote is sold out. Do we keep the program as planned?" Tony stared at it for a long time before typing a reply. "No, we're changing everything." He hit send, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and kept driving. Somewhere far behind him, a man sat on a porch in Texas, sipping his coffee, smiling faintly toward the horizon. And somewhere ahead, in the heart of the world Tony had built, the first cracks of transformation were beginning to form. Not from noise, but from silence. The jet descended through layers of cloud, the skyline of Los Angeles glimmering below like a constellation trapped in glass. Tony Robbins leaned against the window, watching the familiar sprawl emerge beneath him. The city looked unchanged, glittering, restless, unending. But something in him no longer fit its rhythm. The noise of engines, the chatter of passengers, the sterile announcements over the intercom, all of it pressed against the fragile calm he had built during his days in Texas. He closed his eyes and tried to hold on to the memory of the ranch, the creak of the porch, the sound of the windmill, Chuck's unhurried voice. But already it was being drowned by the approaching storm of his other life. When the plane touched down, his phone lit up with messages. The screen pulsed with names: Leah, his assistants, his publicist, media contacts, sponsors, board members. All wanted confirmation, reassurance, leadership. He turned it face down on the tray table and sat still until the other passengers began filing out. Only then did he move, his long stride carrying him through the terminal with the ease of habit and the reluctance of awakening. Outside, a black SUV waited. His driver, Carl, greeted him with the usual cheerful professionalism, but Tony barely responded. As the car merged into traffic, skyscrapers rose like monuments to ambition. Billboards still bore his face from the recent tour, slogans blazing across them. Unleash, awaken, transform. He felt a strange detachment watching his own smile beam down from a 50-foot canvas. For years, those words had defined him. Now they felt like echoes of someone he used to be. At his office headquarters downtown, the building thrummed with activity. Assistants darted between glass-walled conference rooms, carrying tablets and headsets. The air hummed with caffeine and purpose. Leah was waiting in the main hallway, tablet in hand, her expression both relieved and apprehensive. Finally, she said, walking briskly beside him. We've got a full schedule media at 11, sponsor call at 1, rehearsal at 3. Oh, and about tomorrow's keynote, I've got updated cue sheets. Cancel it, Tony said quietly. Leah stopped mid-step. Cancel what? The keynote, he said. We're changing everything. She blinked, trying to read whether this was strategy or exhaustion. Tony, that event's sold out. 4,000 attendees, live broadcast to 12 countries. You can't just... I can, he interrupted gently, his tone firm but calm. And I will. They stood in silence, the hum of the office around them like static. Leah finally spoke. Then what are we doing instead? He met her eyes. We're doing nothing. She frowned. Nothing? Silence, he said. No lights, no music, no speeches. Just presence. For a long moment, Leah stared at him, searching his expression for irony. There was none. You're serious, right, team? She said. As serious as I've ever been, he replied. The rest of the day unfolded in fragments, a blur of meetings turned arguments, of confused staff and anxious producers. The announcement sent shockwaves through the company. Some thought it was a publicity stunt, others a nervous breakdown. His executive partner, Mark Dunn, cornered him in the boardroom late in the afternoon. Tony, you've built a brand on momentum, Mark said, pacing. People expect energy, transformation, spectacle. That's what they pay for. They pay for noise, Tony said evenly. But what if what they need is silence? Silence doesn't sell, Mark snapped. This isn't a monastery, it's business. Tony's voice didn't rise. Maybe that's the problem. Mark stopped pacing, his face hardening. You think one weekend with Chuck Norris makes you a prophet? Tony didn't flinch. No, it made me a listener. Mark exhaled sharply and walked out, muttering about investors and contracts. When the door shut, Tony was left alone with his reflection in the glass wall. Behind him, the city glowed like a circuit board. In it, he saw both everything he had built and everything he had lost. That night, he went home to his quiet house on the hills. It had always been designed for serenity, minimalist decor, wide windows, soft lighting, but it had never felt truly peaceful until now. He made tea, sat on the terrace, and let the city lights shimmer below him. His thoughts drifted to Chuck. He wondered what the older man was doing at that very moment, probably sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, untroubled by headlines or expectations. He envied that simplicity. No, not envied, admired. For years, he had taught others how to conquer the external world, but Chuck had shown him how to inhabit the internal one. The following morning, the backlash began. Social media exploded with speculation. Tony Robbins cancels major event. Fans confuse. Spiritual breakdown or masterclass in mindfulness. Sponsors demanded explanations. Journalists requested interviews. His communications director pleaded with him to issue a statement. He refused all of it. For once, he didn't want to explain himself. When the day of the event arrived, the auditorium was packed. Thousands of people sat waiting, restless and murmuring. Cameras were ready, lights dimmed, music cued, but none of it began. At precisely noon, Tony stepped onto the stage. The applause was automatic, a reflexive roar of expectation. He waited for it to die, then walked to the center and stood there without speaking. Minutes passed. At first, the audience was confused. Whispers spread. Was this part of the show? Some new exercise in suspense? But Tony remained silent, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes calm. The silence grew heavier. The murmurs turned uneasy. Some laughed nervously. Others pulled out their phones. Then gradually something began to shift. The restlessness thinned. The laughter died. One by one, people stopped moving, sensing something unspoken unfolding among them. Tony finally spoke, his voice low but resonant. I've spent my life talking. Today I want to see what happens when we listen. He said nothing more. He closed his eyes, breathing steadily. The cameras hesitated, some operators glancing toward their directors for instruction. But no one dared break the spell. The silence deepened until the auditorium seemed to vibrate with it. For the first time, Tony wasn't performing. He was present. It lasted 10 minutes, then 15. By the 20th, some people began to weep quietly. Others simply sat still, eyes closed, breathing in rhythm with him. It wasn't meditation in the formal sense. It was communion, unchoreographed and raw. No music guided them. No voice instructed. The absence became its own teacher. When Tony finally opened his eyes, he saw the audience differently, not as followers, but as mirrors. Their faces weren't lit by spectacle, but by recognition. He stepped forward to the edge of the stage and spoke quietly. "That," he said, "is what I came to share." He turned and left the stage. No crescendo, no anthem. Just silence and the slow sound of people standing to their feet, not clapping, but breathing together. It was the most honest standing ovation he had ever received. In the aftermath, reactions were polarized. Some called it genius, others madness. Critics accused him of self-indulgence, while others hailed it as a revolution in spiritual communication. But Tony didn't care about any of it. Something fundamental had shifted, not just in him, but in those who had been there. Emails flooded in from attendees describing how that half hour of silence had been more transformative than any seminar they'd ever attended. Words like real, raw, and free appeared again and again. Leah came to his office that evening. She stood in the doorway hesitant. "You did it," she said softly. Tony looked up from his desk. "Did what?" "Scared everyone," she said with a faint smile, "and somehow healed them at the same time." He chuckled quietly. "That wasn't me." "Then who was it?" He thought for a moment. "Maybe it was all of us finally shutting up long enough to hear what matters." Leah leaned against the doorframe. "So what now? Another silent seminar?" He shook his head. "No plans, just truth." As the weeks passed, the movement grew beyond him. Smaller events began replicating the format: no lights, no spectacle, just people gathering in silence. The press dubbed it the stillness movement. Some mocked it as a fad, but others felt its pull deeply. Across the country, people who had never met found themselves sitting together in quiet rooms, rediscovering the weight of shared stillness. Tony knew it wasn't about him anymore. That was precisely why it mattered. One evening, months later, he received a letter, not an email, but a handwritten note with a Texas return address. "Heard what you did," it read. "Looks like you listened after all. Proud of you. CN." Tony smiled as he folded it carefully and set it on his desk. Outside, the city glowed as always, restless and bright. But inside his office, the quiet felt deeper, fuller. He reached for the wooden carving Chuck had given him. The two hands pressed together and held it between his palms. The surface had smoothed over time, the wood warmed by touch. It no longer felt like a token. It felt like truth. He turned off the lights, letting darkness settle around him. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to fill it. Somewhere beyond the horizon, on a quiet Texas ranch, he imagined Chuck doing the same, sitting in his chair, watching the stars, content in the knowledge that silence, once planted, grows on its own. And in that moment, Tony finally understood the paradox that had haunted him for years. That true transformation doesn't roar through microphones or ignite in fireworks. It begins in the quiet, in the small pause between one breath and the next. And it endures not because it is heard, but because it is felt. The morning after the silence event, the world seemed different, though the city itself remained the same. Traffic still snarled through the streets, horns still blared, and digital billboards still flickered with advertisements promising happiness for a fee. Yet for Tony Robbins, everything now moved at a slower frequency, as if someone had turned the volume of existence down just enough to let him finally hear life's quieter notes. His phone still buzzed, his name still trended online, and his brand continued to grow in ways he could no longer measure. But none of it mattered anymore. The empire he had built now felt like scaffolding, impressive, towering but empty without the foundation of meaning. He spent the next several days retreating from the noise that had once defined him. The team filled his inbox with proposals, documentaries, partnerships, podcasts, book deals. Each pitch promised to capitalize on what they now called the miracle of silence. He deleted every one of them without replying. For years, he had built his fortune by turning insight into content, wisdom into revenue. But now the very thought of monetizing what he had experienced made him uneasy. You can't sell what can't be owned, he thought. Silence wasn't his to brand, it was everyone's to find. Leah was the only one who seemed to understand. She stopped sending memos and started bringing him tea instead. One evening, she found him sitting alone in the empty auditorium of his training center, the same place where thousands had once shouted his name. Now the room was dark, the stage unlit, the seats shadowed. He sat in the front row, elbows on his knees, staring at the blank stage as if expecting it to speak. "You should see what people are saying," she began softly. "They're calling it a revolution. The stillness movement is everywhere now. Churches, schools, even corporate retreats are copying it." Tony smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's working." "Shouldn't we guide it?" she asked. "At least make sure it stays authentic?" He shook his head. "Authenticity can't be managed. The moment we try to own it, we kill it." Leah studied him for a long time. "You really have changed," she said. "Maybe I've just stopped pretending to lead," he replied. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, Tony walked onto the empty stage. He stood at the center, the same spot where he had stood so many times before, but now it felt like sacred ground. He imagined all the people who had filled those seats, crying, shouting, searching, and felt a swell of tenderness rather than pride. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and whispered to the darkness, "Thank you." It wasn't gratitude for success or redemption, but for the collapse that had made both possible. In the weeks that followed, he declined interviews, ignored media requests, and quietly canceled his upcoming tour. The world predictably speculated. Headlines declared Tony Robbins retires from speaking, the guru who went silent, transformation's last lesson. But Tony wasn't retreating, he was simplifying. The man who once filled arenas now spent his days walking along the beach at dawn or sitting in parks unnoticed, watching the world breathe. Sometimes people recognized him and hesitated before approaching, uncertain what to say. He would smile kindly and nod, but rarely spoke. When he did, his words were brief and gentle, often leaving more space than sound. One morning, while reading on his terrace, he received a package without a return label. Inside was a small wooden box, hand-carved, the surface smoothed by years of touch. When he opened it, he found a note folded inside, written in neat, steady handwriting. "Come back to the ranch when you're ready. The porch still has your seat." C. Tony held the note for a long time, feeling a slow warmth spread through him. A week later, he drove again through the endless stretches of Texas. The air grew cleaner the farther he went, the sky wider. When he arrived, the ranch looked exactly as he remembered it, simple, sunlit, unbothered by time. Chuck was sitting on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. When he saw Tony's car pull up, he smiled faintly, as if he had been expecting him all along. "Took you long enough," Chuck said as Tony stepped out. "I was waiting for the noise to die down," Tony replied. "It never really does," Chuck said. "You just stop hearing it." They sat side by side, the old wooden boards creaking softly beneath them. The silence between them felt easy, like two long-separated friends resuming a conversation without needing to catch up. After a while, Tony spoke. "The world's gone crazy over what happened," he said. "They're trying to turn it into a brand. People want to package silence now." Chuck gave a small laugh. "People will try to sell air if you let them. The trick is not to breed their version of it." "I've shut it all down," Tony said. "The tours, the partnerships, everything. I don't know what comes next." "Maybe nothing needs to," Chuck said. "You've already said what you needed to say. Now it's time to live it." They sat for a while longer, watching the sun drift lower in the sky. The light spread across the fields like liquid gold. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily, its wings catching the glow. Tony felt the urge to speak again, to fill the air with reflection or gratitude, but he resisted. The silence said everything. After dinner, they walked out to the barn. The air inside was cool, heavy with the scent of cedar and old hay. Chuck lit a lantern and hung it from a beam, the soft light flickering across the walls. Tony saw the familiar punching bag, the bench, the Bible in the corner. But now there was something new, a single wooden chair placed in the center of the floor. "I've been thinking about your last event," Chuck said. "The silence thing. You did good. You gave people what they didn't know they were starving for. But remember, it's not yours to keep. The moment you start guarding it, it slips away. I know, Tony said. I think that's why I'm here. I needed to remember who it belongs to. Chuck nodded toward the chair. Sit. Tony obeyed without question. Close your eyes, Chuck said. Now tell me, what do you hear? Tony listened. At first, only his own breathing, then the faint hum of wind outside, the creak of wood, a dog barking far off, the rhythm of a heartbeat, not his own, but the houses, the lands, something larger. I hear everything, Tony whispered. Chuck smiled. Good. Now what do you feel? Tony paused. Stillness and peace, but not the easy kind. The kind that costs something, Chuck said. The real kind always does. When Tony opened his eyes, Chuck was watching him with quiet pride. You've come a long way, he said. But don't forget, this isn't the end. It's the beginning. People think silence is the finish line, but it's just the door. Tony nodded slowly. Then what's beyond it? Chuck looked at him with that same calm certainty that had once unsettled him on the stage months ago. Everything you were too busy talking to notice. That night, Tony stayed in the guest room again. The house creaked softly as he drifted to sleep, the sounds of crickets and wind wrapping around him like a lullaby. He dreamed of a vast auditorium filled not with noise, but with light, thousands of people sitting together in perfect stillness, their faces illuminated by peace. When he woke at dawn, the dream lingered like a blessing. In the morning, Chuck was already outside, training with slow precision beneath the rising sun. Tony joined him wordlessly, their movements in quiet harmony. When they finished, they sat again on the porch, coffee steaming between them. You know, Chuck said after a while, a man spends half his life trying to be heard, and the other half learning how to listen. If he's lucky, he gets to experience both. Tony smiled. I guess I've been lucky then. Chuck looked out over the fields. You've been blessed. Luck fades. Blessing stays. When Tony finally prepared to leave, Chuck handed him a folded envelope. Don't open it until you get home, he said. Tony promised. They shook hands, the gesture firm, steady, full of wordless respect. Then he got into his car and drove away, the ranch shrinking in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. Back in Los Angeles, as night fell over the city, Tony sat on his terrace once more, the unopened envelope resting in his lap. For a while he just looked at it, tracing the familiar handwriting. Finally he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just one line written across it. The loudest voice you will ever hear is the one you stop running from. He read it 3 times before setting it down beside the wooden carving on his table. Outside, the city continued its restless symphony of horns and sirens, but Tony no longer heard it the same way. Beneath the chaos, there was a rhythm, a quiet pulse that connected everything. He stood, walked to the window, and gazed out at the skyline. Somewhere far away, he imagined people sitting in silence, just as he had months ago, rediscovering what it meant to simply be. He smiled faintly, then turned off the lights. In the dark, the room felt alive. It wasn't emptiness, it was presence. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and whispered the words that had begun it all. I don't crush fear, he said. I listen to it. And in that moment, he felt the world listening back. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe right now. New powerful stories are coming every day. Don't stop here. Check out the next video and discover what happens when silence changes everything. And if you felt something today, share this video. Someone you know needs to hear it.